Okay. So it looks like we've got a good number of participants here today. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Happy Halloween to those of you who are joining us in costume. And welcome to today's webinar, which is on putting PD feedback to work. So I'm your host, Carly Norton. I'm the Director of Marketing at KickUp, which is a company of educators working with districts nationally to manage job-embedded professional learning, assess program impact, and use formative data to drive better decision-making. And really in our work, one of the most common sources of PD data that our partner districts are collecting is post-PD feedback. But while it's become standard practice to collect feedback after a professional learning activity, really what we see is that it's what comes next that can be the hardest part, putting that data into action. So today, we're bringing together two practitioners, K-12 district leaders, that have a conversation about post-PD feedback and really how they're using it. So specifically, we want to understand how these two innovative Texas districts are using their post-PD feedback, like in practice. We also want to share some tips for creating feedback-driven professional learning systems, and then discuss best practices for leveraging that data to guide decision-making. So to give you an overview of how we'll spend our time, because we really want to get out of here at 1:45 and make sure that you do have that last 15 minutes of your hour. So we're going to spend a few minutes just getting to meet our panelists and introducing them. Then we're really going to allocate the bulk of this time to a conversation unpacking how they're collecting and using their post-PD feedback data within their districts. And then, of course, we'll have some time for Q&A, which is an opportunity for the audience to submit questions, as well as a few polls scattered around for you to help us guide our conversation to make sure that we're really addressing the things that feel top of mind to our participants today. But enough housekeeping. So I want to introduce you to the real stars of today, our two featured guests here that are on our webinar. The first is Dr. Glenda Horner. And Dr. Horner is the Director of Professional Learning at Cypress-Fairbanks ISD, which is a large district outside of Houston. And correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Horner, but I think you guys have about 115,000 students.
We're hedging close toward 118 at this point, where we've passed the 117,000 mark.
Yeah, so quite a number of students, and that translates to what, about 7,000 teachers?
Yeah, we have close to 8,000 teachers.
Wow. And then our second panelist here is Anna Jackson, who's the Executive Director of Leadership and Professional Development at Lubbock ISD, also in Texas. Big state, we love Texas. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, Anna, but I believe you guys have about 30,000 students. And how many teachers?
So when we have all of our instructional staff together, we run about 3,000, but that includes our paras as well. So when we're doing our training that we're using KickUp for, we are often looking at data around 1,800 people that are giving us feedback from an instructional perspective.
Great. Yeah, so a lot of teachers and a lot of feedback. So to jump right in, would love to get to know you a little bit better and about what professional learning looks like in your districts. And maybe I'll toss that over to Anna to start us off.
Okay, so professional learning in our district, we have one main vehicle that we use to deliver a lot of our training. We have all of the traditional things with the summer PD and instructional coaching training specific to roles. But one piece that we are really focused on in our district is what we call content focus sessions. Content focus sessions are once per 6 weeks in our district, and it does involve all of our instructional personnel. So both certified and non-certified people who are working to provide instruction to students, and we get them into small groups by content and grade level in order to help really look at their standards, help them with their planning, and discuss assessment and make sure that we have got them set up for success in the upcoming 6 weeks. So we have over 170 people that we train to help us turn around those small group training pieces. And we really try to look at what do we do to provide ongoing support in between those content focus sessions in order to make sure that we are meeting the needs of all of our learners. One of the things we love about this content focus session approach is it really allows us to differentiate both by content and grade level, but also to put in some strands for our new teachers or new to the district and our veterans to make sure that we're able to meet their needs and really support them in the way that's most meaningful to them.
Great. And how many different content focused sessions, or how many like different strands are you working with?
So we have 6 different actual content focus sessions, and strands within those we have by elementary, middle, and high school. So elementary and secondary divisions for each of the core contents. And in addition, we also have our world languages, our CTE folks, our fine arts folks. So it's deep and wide.
Yeah, great. And what about you, Dr. Horner?
Well, as a large district, we have, I guess I would call them several different buckets of professional learning. Our office directly isn't responsible for all of the buckets. We advise and guide and provide resources. But for example, our student services department, they handle all things as it relates to classroom management and things of that nature, and creating, a safe learning environment for kids. Our curriculum department handles all the things that, of course, our teachers need that's more content specific. Our department most directly works with administrators and providing them relevant learning as well. And then, of course, our non-teaching professionals, our paraprofessionals, providing them guidance and support as well.
Right. And so within that context, I'm curious what data, when you look at all of the professional learning that you're offering, and of course wanting to continuously improve it, what data, did you need to collect and want to collect? And I'll toss that over to Anna first.
Okay. So for us, it was really, really important for us to collect quality data. We had identified 5 years ago through our strategic action process that we had a wealth of offerings for professional learning, but we weren't seeing the implementation in classrooms that we were wanting to see. So we really spent the last 5 years as a district trying to close that knowing and doing gap. So as we set up content focus sessions in particular, we really tried to be very specific about what we were doing to help us move from just the basic level of how did you like the PD to how are you using that in your classroom and what kind of supports do you need. So prior to our involvement with KickUp, we were using Google Forms to help us collect that data. And we had some success with that, but we didn't feel like it was providing us the same kind of data outputs that we wanted to really analyze the implementation piece and make sure that people felt equipped for what it would take to do that. So we were collecting all of the traditional types of survey data. We felt like we had beefed that up a lot with the tools that we were revising, but KickUp has really stepped in to help us take that kind of to the next level and produce some heat maps to help us really analyze, are we hitting the mark with what we're trying to do, not just with providing learning, but are they able to take that and transition that back to the classroom? So our content focus session design group gets together after each and analyzes that data to look and see where are we hitting the mark, where do we need to adjust, where do we need to deploy people to go provide some additional support. So that data that we're collecting through the surveys is super critical to driving our work and helping us know how we need to shift and adjust. It's a hard thing in a district when you're doing training on such a large scale. To be able to turn that quickly because we have so many people that we have to train to help us train. It's a lot easier in the smaller pieces that we do on an ongoing kind of basis, but content focus session requires so much input from so many people, taking that input and analyzing it and then turning back around to make changes. So if we didn't have the data, I don't think that we would be nearly as effective in what we're doing. And then also kind of to that end, we have found that people in our district are building their confidence in our data and in our responsiveness to that data, which has been really critical to getting even more feedback from them, because I think that they have been able to see that, oh, we said this and they did that. And so I think the data has allowed us to make direct correlations between we're listening to you and we're responding to your personal learning needs. So that's been huge for us.
Yeah. And when you talk about, the different types of data that you were collecting, and I know that you touched on the fact that bringing it together, really made it more usable. But I'm curious in terms of what you were collecting. How did you, we want to know so many things, right? Like there's so many questions that you want to ask the participants within professional learning, but how did you guys break down, like, what are the key things that we need to know within this large universe where we can't ask everything that we want to know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually fortunate to get to be a part of Learning Forward Academy. For some of your viewers may be a part of Learning Forward and know about that. And you have to develop a problem of practice, and then you spend 2 years kind of building. And I went into that thinking, I am going to solve the problem of closing the knowing doing gap and knowing just how to evaluate professional learning. And 2 years later, I walked out thinking, I still don't know if I know how to learning because it's such a complex thing. But one thing I did learn in that has been super, super important for me is looking at Gus Keys' different levels and looking at, you do want some feedback from participants just on how did it work? Did the logistics meet your needs? Did we take care of all of that? Did you get what you were trying to learn? To what did you learn? Did we hit the knowledge and skills that you were wanting and needing in that? And were we successful in accomplishing that? Level 3 was an area that has been really big for us. And I think it continues to be an area of growth that I'm working on. We ask people to change a lot, but do we put the supports in place to make that change possible? So level 3 is really asking, what kind of ongoing supports do you need? What kind of changes do we have to make in the organization to help you do these things that we're asking you to do? And then shifting to their new knowledge and skills, how are you going to use that? And then finally, looking at student learning outcomes. And I think that one's hard for us to jump to because we're really hesitant to say, oh, the PD is the thing that fixed that and made those scores go up, because we all know that's 1,000 things to make that happen. But Joelle and Killian once said in our academy that, we're very quick to say, oh, scores aren't going up, our PD must not be working. We can also make that same thing that, oh, scores are going up, our PD must be working. And so knowing that it's one of many factors is something that's always true, but we do have to connect it back to that work. So having kind of those 5 levels and then discovering that KickUp had the ability to help us track that a little bit more intelligently, it was huge for us.
Yeah. And, one thing that's always been interesting to me about Gus Keys' 5 levels is that so frequently, people think of post-PD feedback as just level 1. And it's certainly, that is the bread and butter of level 1. But, what I think is interesting is hearing you guys talk about how you're accomplishing, some of level 2 and some of level 3 within your post-PD feedback. And the idea that there are ways to get it within your post-PD feedback, was the knowledge and skills, like, were they actually acquired, during the time, whether it's in an immediate post-PD feedback or it's, a month later, or some kind of follow-up post-PD feedback as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we look at this not as summative data, we look at it as formative data. And so it is constantly a work in progress to make us adjust and change what we're doing. So that's super helpful.
Great. And Dr. Horner, I'm curious on your end, knowing, looking more at leadership training, what data, when you were thinking about what data did you need to collect in order to know whether your program was working or improving your program, what was on your mind?
Well, honestly, the slide before was such a beautiful jumping off point for us as well, and striving more toward that level 2 and level 3 and even tiptoeing into level 4. And I agree with exactly what Anna had said about level 5, that there are so many things that feed an experience, and whether or not the professional development was the thing that knocked it out of the ballpark, I can't say that, but I can tell you that it is one of the things that help us continue to achieve the level of success that we have as a district. And so just a little bit of our story and kind of the angle that we came at this from was really two different pathways, and I'm really going to focus on one of them today, but I'd love for everybody to know that there's so much possibility when you partner with a group like KickUp. So one of those pathways was really just determining whether or not a couple of programs that we do oversee in our office, whether or not they really were giving us the biggest bang for our buck. So one of those was new teacher induction, which is something that's near and dear to my heart, especially after having navigated a first year of teaching with my daughter most recently. And then the second kind of avenue that we traveled down was on the leadership development side. And as a district, this was a journey that started back in 2012 before I even knew who KickUp was. And we brought together an ad hoc committee that became a long-standing commitment at the charge of our superintendent, who said, hey, we want, in Cy-Fair, we want the premier district, not just in the state, but in the nation, as it relates to preparing and kind of fleshing out a pipeline to the principalship. And then that became even bigger than that, because it became glaringly obvious that we weren't just fleshing out a pipeline to the principalship, we were fleshing out a pipeline to leadership. And in that journey, one of the things that we further refined and developed is what we call a Leadership Institute series. And so we've got, at this point in 2019, we have 7 different institutes underneath that series that feed our pipeline. And that really is where the KickUp work comes into play, where we're able at each of their learning experiences to determine and allow them, I won't say determine, but allow them to provide us with meaningful feedback that we're able to track over time. And so on this next slide, if we can go ahead and hop there, it gives you a little bit of a visual of the work that we speak of, and not only giving us, post-PD feedback, but also we do a yearly survey through KickUp where we ask all of our district and campus leaders several key questions to determine whether or not what our program effectiveness is. And so it allows us to provide and collect that formative feedback all along the way so that we can inform what we're going to do differently as we continue to move forward. So you'll see here an example. Back in 2012, we asked the question, we first began asking the question, one of their initial questions is in regard to ethnicity, and wondering whether or not we really were mirroring the demographics of our district. So if you take a look at the chart that's there to the left, those are the demographics, our student demographics, because we are continuing to become more and more diverse. And so we wanted to make certain that the leaders who led these students on our campuses, who led the teachers, who led the students on our campuses, we wanted to make certain that we are more in alignment with our student demographics. So you can see we're not quite there yet, but you do see some growth between 2019 and before that, 2012 and 2019, I should say, where we are moving in that direction. And here we have data, because you really can't argue with data, right? And so we're able to put this in front of our board and our superintendent, as well as our campus leaders, to say, hey, what are we doing? Is what we're doing really mattering? And it just allows us a platform to collect all of that from a longitudinal standpoint.
Great. So I know that when you go into planning PD feedback, everything sounds perfect. And we come in with a very intentional and aligned plan, and then inevitably there are some challenges. And I think we also have an audience poll that we're launching. I'm not the technology person here, but I believe our audience should be seeing a poll as well, because we want to hear from you too. But I'd love to hear, Anna and Dr. Horner, about some of the challenges that you faced in collecting the data that you were looking for from post-PD feedback. Yeah.
So I would say for us, and looking specifically at the poll right here, you hit on a couple. The first two really hit on something that we were struggling with. One of the things that we have wrestled with for some time is just making sure that people had trust enough to be able to give us quality feedback. And we discovered that some people feel less confident about doing that. They worry, oh, is this going to come back on me? If I make a negative comment, is that somehow a negative reflection on me? And so initially, we really had to work hard to earn their trust in order to get sufficient responses. And so we had to be very, very clear that the data that we're collecting was anonymous data. There are some limitations to that, because anonymous data also means that we can't be quite as strategic in providing support as we would like to. And that's been actually one of the things we've loved about KickUp, is because we've been able to put in a few other things to help us filter our data, just to help us know better how to meet the needs, even though we may not have specific individuals that we are working to support. But having a system and figuring out ways to collect feedback, one, where people knew that they could trust us, two, that they could trust us to change based upon that feedback, and three, just knowing that we were holding them in a safe place, really led to an increase in our responses. So we went from, just having a few hundred responses to having in the thousands or above, 1,000 with our responses. And I really think that we continue to see an uptick in that, because people know that they can trust us, and they know that we're going to use that data well. And so our responses have really improved a lot over time as a part of that. We had been, as soon as we started our design, we put in opportunities to review the data and knew how we wanted to use the data. So for us, that part wasn't as big of a struggle. It was really about getting the data so that we could take those other steps that we needed to take.
Yeah. And how do you build in time to share, or to make sure that the people who are responding to your surveys, that they know that you're using the data?
So one of the things, first of all, we make sure that they do the surveys before they leave that day, so that we have once you get into your car, it's going to be so much harder to get it. And so that's one thing we've done. Two, we calendared on our calendars a year in advance when we were going to sit down and do it, because all of our calendars are so crazy that we know that if we have not built that into the calendar on the front end, it's going to be really hard to get a group the size that we need together to analyze it. And then three, we try to be really transparent in our district, regardless of whether we're talking content focused session or anything else. When we make a change, we label that change and we say, based on your feedback, we have made this adjustment. Based on what you said in previous surveys, we are making this change. Based on what you told us, we do that. So that we're always making that connection, that we're listening, we want to hear you, we want to respond to you, because we work for them. They don't work for us. And so we've got to make sure that what we're designing is what is meeting their needs, because they're our customer.
And for us in Cypher, we make it, it's part of our tagline, right? As far as we listen to the voice of our customer, and how essential and how important that is, to make certain that they really do know that we're listening. One of the challenges that Anna talked about was making certain that you're getting enough responses back. And so she hit the nail on the head, and that's exactly what we do, is collecting it before they even leave that space, before they break away, building time into your agenda to collect the data. And then the other thing that we do with a couple of the groups that we work with, we also train the facilitators who lead that learning. And so we sit down with them at the end of each meeting, and we pull up the KickUp feedback, and we actually attend to it and talk about our gems and opportunities. What's a gem from this feedback, and where are some opportunities, and then what are we going to do about it? and then giving us the opportunity in that very next meeting to be responsive to what it is the voice of our customer has expressed.
Yeah. And you guys have queued up the next question perfectly, as well as our audience poll. The number one challenge that came out is really, how are you using the data like for future supports? And you know, I know you just talked a little bit about it, Dr. Horner, but would love to hear other ways that you guys are taking this data and how it gets used.
We talk about it all the time. We sit down formal times to make it happen, where it's calendared in, where we have the opportunity to round up with my immediate team, getting together with our extended leadership team, sharing it back with the respondents to let them know, hey, here's what you said, here's what you asked for, and here's how we are able to attend to that, or how we're able to respond to that. So it's about keeping it in front of you, because it's super, super easy, right, to collect the data. That's the easy part, honestly. The tough part then, and that goes back to the challenge, because these are great statements to couple together, great questions to couple together. The challenge, of course, is acting on that feedback and making certain that you are holding yourself accountable to that.
Yeah. And I agree with everything that she said. I love getting to hear that our experiences are so similar in so many ways. One of the things that we do with the data in our district is we have used that to help us deploy our instructional coaching support. So we have lots of different ways that we look at our campuses and we use all kinds of student data to help figure out some of our deployment, but also being able to use this PD data to help us know where we might need to put in a few other structures. So on this slide, you can see some of our questions there on the left, and across the top, you can see some of the different groups that we're working with. And this is just a really clear image of where it's a heat map of our responses in the groups. And one of the things that's interesting to me as I look at this is that when you think about in our district, our CTE, we have a super, super, super strong program. But there's only one plumber teaching plumbing, and there's only one, electrician or welder, so it's so specific that I think providing the PD that meets their needs best is a greater challenge. I would say the same with our world languages. With our world languages, many of our teachers were a district of innovation, and we have teachers who were teaching or dentists in Mexico last year. They're now teaching Spanish in our classes here because they are the ones best equipped to do that, and we're able to hire them as a district of innovation. Their needs are very, very different, and so I think that's what you see reflected in the differences there, is that we've got to just be really specialized in the work that we provide to them. So in addition to the things that we're doing with KickUp with our surveys, we have begun using KickUp to keep our coaching logs as well. And so our coaches at both the district and the campus level, every time they go into a campus, they're able to keep the time there, who they saw, what kind of responses and support they provided. They're able to connect it to our coaching cycle so that we can see what kind of support is being provided and look at the time spent with that, which helps us target trends over time. It helps us be reflective and responsive. It helps us give feedback to principals on what we're doing on their campuses, helps us talk to our school board about how we're using these coaches and how we're being intentional with the work. So that being able to connect the PD to that coaching piece has been really big for us, in terms of just making sure that we're hitting level 3, which is about what kind of ongoing supports and organizational things do you need in order to be able to make those changes. So we've been able to connect our responses straight to our PD feedback and provide one more layer of support through our coaches.
Yeah. And is this, when you're building in this data collection, how does it get shared back with the facilitators of the supports?
So we have our academic services team, which includes our PD department, our curriculum and instruction department, and our special services, which I've got to be very clear to say that when we're talking about PD actually has, in some ways, the smallest role because they're the ones that are providing so much of that. Our job is to help coordinate and support it. So when we get together and have our academic services team, we look at the data from a holistic standpoint, but then we break down into our smaller subgroups and we analyze it through that lens. So we analyze what we're doing with the PD, and then we're also we're able, with the way the instructional coaching piece is set up, to be transparent about sharing that data and being able to share it with our executive principals or share it with our principals, share it with across our departments, and just make sure that we are able to hit it. I was in a conversation just this week. We had an outside consultant in, and when the question came up about how much instructional coaching is taking place, I was able to say, we've been there 195 hours this month or this year. And so it really helps us even in connecting our external supports to have data. And then if I am the math coach and you come in behind me and you're a special ed coach, they can see one another's work in that coaching log so that they're not pulling in different directions, but we can really be strategic about having everybody from the principal to the teacher to the coaches moving in one direction.
Yeah. I love that point about, pulling in the data from the different activities, like seeing what's happening and being able to tie that, whether it's PD or coaching, all of the different hours back to this kind of feedback. Just get by, what shifts it's making and what impact it's having formatively during the year.
Yeah, and I would just say one other thing on that. There in having conversations, sometimes we might think, we're out there a lot. We're on your campus all the time doing planning and supporting the planning. And maybe what they're needing is the modeling. Maybe that's the thing that they're really hoping to get from it. So the way it's broken down, we're able to have some conversation to say, well, is what you're getting what you're needing? Or do we need to make adjustments there? And so I think that is a huge piece as well.
Great. Well, I know that we also want to have some time for Q&A, so maybe we could open up the Q&A. And while we do that, we already have an audience question as well that was submitted. I think I see Greg from Youngstown here as well, who submitted this question to us in advance. So you guys should see on your screen a couple options to submit questions. I believe it's at the bottom of your screen. There's a little Q&A button. So if you're joining us and you would like to drop in a question there, you can. But in the meantime, I wanted to toss this out from Greg. How do you engage the people who fall in the middle when it comes to feedback? Because a lot of the time we hear so much from the people who love it, and we hear from the people who are grumbling because they hate it. But what happens with the people in the middle?
I think it's pretty much what Anna and I have talked about before, and she can, of course, add more to it. But as far as collecting that feedback before you leave the room, because you're exactly right. So if I'm going to respond to a survey after I've left something, it's going to be because I loved it or I hated it. I'm not the middleman there. The middle guy or girl is not necessarily going to respond. So I think one way to attend to that is collect the feedback while they're in your space, while they're in the room together. But the challenge, of course, is building time into your agenda for that. But making it a priority, and then it becomes routine and people anticipate that they're going to have the opportunity to provide their feedback.
I would agree with that. And then I would also just add to it, another thing that we've alluded to is that when people start to see that change happens because of the feedback they're giving, they're much more likely to give it. And so I would say that in connection with what Glenda was saying, that's the second point on that, to make sure that everybody feels like, hey, this is worth my time to give you this feedback.
They really listen.
Mm-hmm.
I know that one thing that we see as well with some of our partners is that an open-ended response can be such a great tool for really understanding the why. And so when you notice that, for instance, I think we have a slide with some of your data, Dr. Horner, here, and when you hover over it, you can see that many of the people fall in the middle here. And what we see is that, when you get that kind of question, that begs for the follow-up to really try to understand why. And a lot of the richness can be in that, open-ended response to understand why so many people are falling kind of in the middle.
Exactly. And I think this slide, as well as the one that Anna provided, do such a great job of illustrating that at a glance, if you look at it at the surface level, the feedback looks overwhelmingly positive. And not to say that it wasn't an amazing opportunity for them to learn. However, we are remiss if we don't dig a little deeper. And so that's the reason why I wanted to pop that there, is because to dig, we need to peel away at the onion to see the impact holistically that opportunity had on people.
Yep. And we have a question from Carmen Stagg. Anna mentioned, balancing the tension between anonymous data and responding to specific support requests, and wondering if you could elaborate just a little bit more on how you balance that tension and use different data filters.
Yeah, and that definitely is the hardest part, I think. But what we are able to do with the way, so I have to say first and foremost that KickUp, the support that we get through that to help us personalize our instruments is unbelievable.
It's phenomenal.
Above and beyond. They really do help personalize it, and they help you think differently about the way you connect and collect the data. So I may not be able to say, oh, it's this second grade teacher at this campus in this content, but they have helped us put in some different filters that allow us to know that second grade content is struggling. And then we're able to go through, and that certainly narrows the focus. Instead of saying, oh, it's ELAR, we're able to come down to a smaller group and be able to have a little bit more clarity of where do we need to tighten our ship a little bit so that we're really addressing the needs within that group. And then again, just what we know with quality PD, if we're only doing it here and nothing is happening in the in-between, then we're not going to see the job embedded change that we really want to see anyway. So it's not just this and this, but it's also our follow-up conversations in between. So they structure it so that we know a little bit better about where to direct those conversations, but then it takes a little bit more face time to really narrow it down and make sure that we've provided that level of support. We had to make a decision. Is it more important to us to have very little data and know exactly who it is, and it's probably going to be the people who are really happy and really mad? Or is it more important to us to have better overall data with a little less ability to filter, but be able to be more strategic in our planning and in our follow-up? And so that's kind of where we had to land with that. And I think Glenda's kind of had a similar experience with that.
Yeah, we actually, honestly, we updated one of our surveys from last year to this year because we thought we were asking too many questions that would allow us to pinpoint exactly the person on that campus. There's a leadership group, one of the leadership groups we work with. We actually pulled back from that because we want our folks to trust us. We want them to be able to give us honest answers and not think, ooh, if I answer that demographic question, they may be able to pinpoint me. And know that I'm the one who had something less than positive to say or whatever. So it's really important in that trust cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I know that, that this is a question that comes up with every partner that we work with. And one of the compromises, some of the practical tips that I've seen our team and our partners make within to compromise and to find that middle ground is things as simple as putting very clear language on your surveys that explain what those questions are being used for. There are ways on the back end where you can ask for their email address, but only for the purposes of tying them to those demographic attributes, like what grade level are they in, what building, what content subjects, so that you can see those high level trends, but you're not connecting it, when you're reviewing the data, you're not connecting it with names. And it does mean that you may not be able to follow up with individual people for supports, but it gives you that higher level context. And what we found is that, that's always requires building trust, but even just talking about it openly and taking time to include that kind of messaging on the survey can go a long way in getting towards that trust level.
And everybody just wants to know why. What are you going to do with this and why? If I know the why, I'm good.
Right.
that goes back to giving them the reasoning why you're asking certain demographic questions.
Yeah, and to your earlier point, Anna, about being very clear with them, this change happened because you shared your feedback. So you can clearly see that we want your feedback because we want to improve things for you. Great. We have time. I guess we have time for maybe one more question. Perfect. I'm looking at the boss over here, who's my timekeeper. So one of the questions that I have is really thinking about that, like, balance again. When you think about setting up the questions within your post-PD feedback, how are you balancing between like specificity, so different questions for each session, versus, you know, are you using the same questions so you can find those higher level trends?
For us, we've tried to be consistent with the questions that we ask so that we're able to gather. Our goal is to collect trend data over time, longitudinal data. And so if your questions are too specific, then it's more difficult for you to trend the data that way. That just wasn't our goal. We wanted to be able to see just patterns and trends from the feedback, and we wanted to see it from year to year as well. And so the KickUp team, though, I have to tell you this, is phenomenal at taking even some of our more specific questions and helping us just open up a little bit, widen our lens, and perhaps ask that question slightly different, and then still get the kind of response that we're hoping to get back. And as far as more specifics, allowing your participant, your survey respondent, to go in and have some free-form field text where they're able to go in and provide you more of that pinpointed specific feedback that then on the backside, we're actually able to tag and look for trends that way. If I see, you know, if I see the same words again and again, let's just say classroom management, and I tag that, then I'm able to pull that data out of even that free-form feedback that sometimes is kind of convoluted and unwieldy because we don't have a really smart way outside of KickUp to tag it and mark it so that we can continue to accomplish what we want to accomplish, which is to see that trend data.
And we're doing the same thing. We are using the same basic format for all of ours. One thing I loved about making this transition is we had been tracking data for several years already. And so we did not want to lose that longitudinal piece. So was able to work with us to roll that in and make things a little bit better. And so now we can still look over time and measure our growth and see how we are progressing towards our own goals. And so that's been really good for us. We are just now expanding to adding additional pieces of PD that we'd really just focused on CFS, and now we're starting to branch out a lot more, and we're going to use the same thing with all of those. Because when you're aligning your questions to Gus Keys' 5 levels, it's going to land you in the right spot. You don't have to have very specific leading questions that are just specific to that session. If you're asking questions around those 5 levels, you end up in a really good place with your analysis. So we feel very safe in doing that and are really excited about that work.
Perfect. Well, I want to jump us forward to our very last slide because it just hit 1:45, so I'm going to wrap this up in the next 60 seconds. But I want to say first, just thank you so much to Anna and Dr. Horner. I know that we would gladly keep you guys here for another hour just to learn more about your program, but we won't. So in terms of follow-up, for those of you who joined us, we hope that you took as much away from today's discussion as we have, but also wanted to point you out towards our blog. It's full of freebies. Whether you're a KickUp client or not, there's plenty of good content there from experts, including we have an After the PD toolkit that has some sample questions. And so what you'll get from us, we're going to send out a copy of today's recording so that you have it, as well as we'll link you to this freebie here so that you have some sample questions on our blog. And the other thing you're going to get from us when you're done closing out this webinar is just a very quick poll. We are a feedback company, so we want to know how well we used your 45 minutes this afternoon, as well as what topics you'd like to hear from us in the future. So thank you guys so much for sharing some time with us, and thank you again to Anna and Dr. Horner, and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
You too.
Thank you, guys. Perfect.